Hello and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I'm going to be sharing my top nonfiction reads from 2020. So as I mentioned in my fiction wrap-up, I read just over 100 books in 2020, which was an excellent reading year for me, and 21 of those books were nonfiction. So about a fifth of the books I read this year were nonfiction, and I have chosen 5 of my very favorites to share with you today. I have ranked these, so we'll start with number 5 and then move our way up to my very favorite read of 2020, which, if you've been watching my other videos, I've talked about quite a bit, so I don't think will be any surprise. So at number 5, we have a short audiobook that I listened to towards the beginning of the year, and that is Wedding Toasts I'll Never Give by Ada Calhoun. And this book is a collection of short essays on marriage that are framed as hypothetical wedding toasts that the author wouldn't actually give in real life. I believe it started off the concept as a newspaper article, and then after the public reception she expanded it into a collection of short essays. I gave this book 4 stars. There was one of the essays that I didn't really agree with as much, and that was what prevented me from giving it 5 stars, but the rest of them were just wonderful insights into marriage and into the realities of being married and staying married. They are funny and insightful and moving and honest, and I highly recommend this essay collection if you are married or thinking of being married. It has some beautifully profound quotes that have stuck with me, and has some concepts that I have kept mulling over since I finished reading this book. So that is my 5th favorite nonfiction. At number 4, we have 1919 by Ewing. And this is a book, I wasn't exactly sure where to classify it, but I did eventually classify it as nonfiction. It's actually a poetry collection based on the 1919 Chicago race riots, and it is just a stunning and moving poetry collection. I was taking screenshots the whole way through because some of these poems were just so incredibly written and captured emotions so well. So we deal with, it's split up into 3 sections. We have a before, during, and after, and then each poem is kind of introduced by a short nonfiction blurb about the events or the people involved in the events, and then we have a poem examining that topic further or describing their perspective or putting into words what the author thought they may have been thinking at the time. So it's a very unique poetry collection. I've never read anything like it that mixes poetry and nonfiction in that way. And obviously it was a very timely topic dealing with protests against racism and police violence. Were definitely topics that we saw a lot in the news this year, and I found this poetry collection encapsulated a lot of the ideas and emotions that I had been seeing on social media so beautifully. So highly, highly recommend. It's a very unique and moving collection of poetry that is anchored in nonfiction. Then at number 3 we have Ivory Vikings, The Mystery of the Most Famous Chessmen in the World and the Woman Who Made Them by Nancy Marie Brown. And this book blew me away actually because it is about the Lewis and Harris chess set, which I have an emotional attachment to. As we can see, I have one of the queens, a replica of one of the queens that I picked up at the museum gift shop in Edinburgh. And the reason why I have such an attachment to this chess set is both that I played chess growing up, but also that my family comes from the remote Scottish Isle where this chess set was found washed up. So this book was just fascinating to me. It went into so much detail that I wouldn't think would even be possible to find out about events that took place in like the 9, 10, 1100s. It's so well researched. And it has a really unique format where we start with the introduction being the missing pieces, and then part 1 is called the Rooks, and the Rooks, chapter 2 the Bishops, chapter 3 the Queens, chapter 4 the Kings, chapter 5 the Knights, and then the acknowledgement is the Pawns. And she kind of goes through and keeps each chapter structured about the relevant players, if that makes sense. So like the chapter on the bishops is all dealing with high-ranking church officials at the time who were commissioning these ivory carvings, and how different bishops had palaces and had ivory carvers in residence, so she was going through how they would have gifted chess sets and other ivory carvings to each other and how that could be linked. And then, you know, the kings and queens were dealing with different influential royal figures. And then the Rook, she's talking about the various military interactions and invasions that were happening across that region of Scandinavia, Nordic countries coming across into Scotland and invading and setting up outposts. I learned so much from this book, and at the same time I was reading it, I was also watching the TV series Vikings with my husband, and they kept referencing real life Vikings, and so I was learning more about the true story behind the characters I was watching on TV, which brought this to life in a special way. But it's just a brilliantly written book. I'm hoping to get to some of her other books early in 2021. She's written quite a bit about famous women, or not so famous women that should be famous from the Viking Age. So I just think it's a really unique perspective that she's sharing here, and she makes a very compelling argument for why the Lewis chessmen were likely carved by a particular female artisan. So I learned a lot about the chess set, about the politics and religious influences on the society at the time, and what life would have been like for people traveling between Viking outposts in Scotland, Iceland, and Scandinavia. So if you're interested in any of those time periods, or learning about a unique woman who was an artist in a male-dominated world, I highly recommend Ivory Vikings. Then at number 2, we have Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, and this edition I actually picked up when I visited the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam 5 years ago now. So I have the bookmark from Anne Frank house. It's one that has been on my TBR since I was probably like 11. So probably close to 20 years on my TBR. And I'm so glad I finally got to it this year. I had seen it recommended as a book that would be kind of an antidote to complaining about being trapped in your house in 2020 for quarantine, and it definitely was an eye-opening perspective on the suffering that people have passed through. To live in an attic for close to 2 years is an experience that I don't think would be possible to relate to without having such a wonderfully insightful and unique piece of writing as Anne Frank's diary. I can see now why it's so famous and so well studied. It is one that I wish I had read when I was younger, but I'm so glad I finally got to this year. If you haven't read it, you definitely should. I'm sure most people have already, but it's beautiful, it's heartbreaking, it's honest. I found it interesting, some of the elements of teenage girlhood that remained universal and constant even for someone passing through such horrific circumstances, and the hope and optimism that she displayed despite situations that I think many of us would find hopeless was inspiring. So this is a book that will definitely stick with me, and it is a haunting story in many ways. Then my number 1 nonfiction read of 2020, and that is The Five, The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold. This book, I don't even have words to explain how much I love this book. It is so well researched, and as someone who's done genealogical research into women in the Victorian era in England, I know how hard it can be to find details about their lives, and the kind of information this author has dug up, not just about the crime and the circumstances surrounding their deaths, but also about their life from childhood up until obviously their tragic demise. The details that she has found about their stories and bringing that to life is absolutely incredible, and has changed my perspective on Jack the Ripper and my perspective on the Victorian era, and especially the challenges that women faced. She brought it to life in a way that I didn't think was possible. Each of these 5 women had moments when their life looked promising and then weathered through poverty, addiction, domestic violence, their life spiraled down to the point where they ended up being vulnerable and in a situation where Jack the Ripper was able to take advantage of that vulnerability. And it was heartbreaking to see how they had been failed, I guess, throughout their life to end up in that situation. I know this is a book that's going to have an impact on how I do genealogical research in the future, particularly for my own Victorian female ancestors. And it is a book that, as I read other pieces of Victorian literature, I find myself mentally referencing all the time, particularly if you watched my Books to Read in Pairs video with The Odd Women by George Gissing. I kept finding parallels between The Five and The Odd Women, and I'm sure as I read more Victorian literature, I will continue to find parallels, because The Five really exposes the failings of the social structure at the time and the impact that had on women living and surviving in the lower classes. Highly, highly recommend if you haven't read it and you have any interest in feminism, true crime, Victorian era writing. It's a must read in my opinion, and I can't recommend it highly enough. So those are my top 5 nonfiction favorites for 2020. I think I had a lot of wins this year in nonfiction and have, I think, really defined and refined my taste in nonfiction, and I'm hoping that I will continue to have a wonderful nonfiction reading year in 2021. So I hope you also read some wonderful nonfiction reads last year, and be sure to also check out my top 5 fiction favorites as well, which is posted in another video. Until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book. Bye.